Hey everybody, welcome back to the studio. Well, I've put it off long enough, and today I need to address the elephant in the room, or I need to address aperture. And aperture is one of these things that it's actually easy to explain, but it's really difficult because so many of the terms have been changed over the years. Not officially, just people say them in one way and mean something else, or mean one way and say something else, and it just gets really confusing. So what is the aperture? Well, the aperture is that number on your lens that tells you how much light is getting through the lens to your camera sensor or to the film. I'm going to refer to it as a sensor just so I don't have to keep repeating myself, say film and sensor, because most people watching this probably have a digital camera. Now, lenses have a minimum aperture and they have a maximum aperture. Now, this is where it gets confusing because some people refer to maximum aperture as the most light that can be let in. Other people say maximum aperture as the least light that can be let in. I'm not going to get into an argument about it. I'm going to refer to the numbers, the small numbers to the large numbers. And I'm going to get rid of the minimum and the maximum and all this other stuff that people argue about for no particular reason. So, if you have a lens, look at the lens. On the end of the lens, you're going to see where it gives you a number. Now, on most lenses, it's actually going to be two numbers. That is your aperture. That's the best that that lens can do. So what is the aperture? Why do we have this? Well, every time you put a piece of glass in the path of the light getting to your camera sensor, you're reducing the amount of light that can get to that sensor. And that's what your aperture is. The amount of light that's reaching the camera sensor. Most times it's coming through many pieces of glass, so it's reduced a lot. On more expensive lenses, the lenses are bigger, they're wider, and there's less pieces of glass, or the glass is higher quality, and that lets more light in. But that's what your aperture is. The amount of light that's reaching from your subject to the sensor. That's your aperture. Now they range anywhere from, well, most commonly 1.2, 1.4, 1.8 is usually your best range. You can probably get lower, but I don't want to know what the price would be if it was lower. And then it goes up used to be in increments, so 1.8 to 3.6 to 4.8 to 5.6 to f8 to f16 to f32, f64 became a thing. Those are the ranges, and as you go up in number, it reduces the amount of light that's getting to your camera sensor. Now that's the basic, that's what it does. If you're out on a bright day and you have a high-speed film in your camera, you need to let less light get into the sensor. So you use a higher number, and that is like pulling curtains. It reduces the amount of light that's going to be able to get through the lens to the sensor. You can also adjust your shutter speed so that it goes faster, and that takes less light or allows less light to get into your sensor. But all the three things that I've talked about in the past, your shutter speed, your ISO, ASA, film speed, or your aperture all work together. They're the exposure triangle, if you would. And using all of those things, we determine how much light we get to the sensor so our pictures are properly exposed and they're not overexposed or underexposed. But like everything in photography, it's not quite that simple. The aperture that you choose also will affect the look of your picture. The lower the number, your 1.2, 1.4, 1.8, f2, you have a shallower depth of field than you do with your higher numbers, your f8, f16, f32, f64s. So what's a shallower depth of field? Well, it has nothing to do with your focus, but it does. You can have an in-focus picture at any aperture, from 1.2 to 64. You can have an in-focus picture. You can also have an out-of-focus picture at any of those apertures. The thing is, when you're at the higher numbers, when you let less light in, your focus or your depth of field is wider. So what the heck do I mean? Okay, so let's imagine we're shooting at f1.2. If you were to focus on my eyeball at f1.2, the tip of my nose, I have a big nose, the tip of my nose and the back of my ear would probably be out of focus, but my eye would be perfectly sharp. If we went up to, let's say, 5.6, you still focus on the same spot on the eye, but now not only is my nose in focus, not only is my ear in focus, but a little bit behind my head and a little bit in front is in focus. That is your focus zone with each aperture, or your depth of field. So as you go up, the higher the number, the more that's in focus. Now, bunny trail. This is an area people get themselves in lots of trouble with. I see photographers that go out there and they shoot f1.2 and they shoot it all the time, and that's all they shoot. And when they're doing headshots, when they're doing a glamour picture, when they're doing a single person's portrait, it looks great. They have the beautiful out of focus background and everything's nice and sharp at the eye and it looks wonderful. Then that person goes out and shoots two people. All of a sudden you have somebody standing a little bit behind the first person. They shoot at their low number aperture, and all of a sudden you notice the eye is sharp in the first picture, or the first person, and then all of a sudden you notice the person standing behind them is out of focus. That's because they're using too shallow of a depth of field. They should have went up to 5.6 to f8, depending upon how far back they're standing, f16, f32. When people start doing groups, they do the same thing. They try shooting at f2, they try shooting at f2.8, they try shooting at f3.5, and the first row looks perfect. Second row is a little bit out of focus, and the third row is just blurrier than blurry. We have to know what the depth of field does for each type of picture. It looks great having a blurry background when you're photographing an elk. It looks wonderful. Or a wolf. It looks wonderful. You look at the picture and you know the wolf is the subject because it's tack sharp. But what happens if there's three wolves? Well, all of a sudden you get one in focus wolf and then you get two blurry wolves. That doesn't look so good. What happens if you're doing a wedding and you got a bride and groom and their family standing there? And all of a sudden you have a beautiful in focus bride and groom, but the rest of the family is just a blur. That's because you've used too small of a number in selecting your aperture. You needed to go up higher. So it's not necessarily a good thing to be able to shoot at 1.2, 1.4, 1.8. You may need to go up higher. Now, a bunny trail. I hear so many times about people going out and getting their portrait lens that shoots at 1.2 or 1.4 or 1.8 or whatever the number is. And they say, oh, it's great, it's wonderful. It will allow me to blur the background and give me that beautiful bokeh. And it will just look, oh. But then they go and they put down a camera and they leave the camera on auto. Well, I'm sorry, but the camera doesn't understand that you wanted that low aperture. It's going to just select what it thinks you want. It's going to change the ISO to where it wants it, or the ASA, and it's going to change the shutter speed to where it thinks you want it, and it's going to change your aperture to where it thinks you want it. It's not going to utilize that lens for how it should be utilized. So if you do want to really play with your depth of field, if you want to adjust all your settings, I strongly recommend at least use your aperture priority and shutter priority, but even more, start to use your manual controls, because that will allow you to set everything. Well, I've done it. I hope I didn't confuse you too much. I'm going to stop here, and I'll talk to you next time. Have a great day. Get out there and take some pictures, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye now.